introducing you to Beth Matteotti. Did I get that?
Oh, I should have told you ahead of time. It's not an
Sorry,
easy one. It's Matteotti. Thank you, Chris.
Matteotti. Beth Matteotti. Sorry about that, Beth. The future is hybrid. How to do hybrid teams right. I'm looking forward to this session, especially now in these days. So Beth, take it away.
Okay, well, hello everyone. Good afternoon. Yeah, my name is Beth Matteotti, and I am an expert in hybrid collaboration or virtual collaboration. So I wanted to offer to you all some thoughts on where the future is going to be. Most companies are going to head in this direction. So you might be here because you think your company may be. And so we've got some tips. This is very much a workshop. It's a short presentation, and then most of the time we're just going to be throwing out ideas on what might work for you in order to lead your team this way. Anyway, the agenda is this. We're going to talk about the challenges of hybrid versus fully remote. We're going to talk about a little bit of brain science on why this is difficult. We're going to discuss some strategies on how to improve hybrid collaboration. And then on your own afterwards, I'm going to give you an activity you can do to start planning for better hybrid collaboration in a meeting that you want to improve in the future. So let's first start with some stats. So the majority of companies are planning to be hybrid. That's because 75, 80% of workers are saying now that they want to work remotely, at least part-time. So they don't necessarily want to work full-time in a hybrid, in a remote setting, but most of them, like about 50% of that, or most of that 80% wants to be about 2 to 3 days a week remote. And it's really important for employers to be thinking about this because the top talent, and we know we're in a tight labor market now and probably for the foreseeable future, is expecting flexibility. So if I've read a lot of statistics about how about 40% of people are saying, if they don't allow me to be hybrid, then I probably will start looking for another job. So let's take a step back though. There's really 3 main types of virtual collaboration. One is that can be collaboration between 2 offices. 2 is that there's collaboration when everyone is remote. And then the third one is actually the most challenging, and that's splitting between some people in the office and some people remote. And so that's what we're calling hybrid. So why is it hard to be hybrid? Well, there's some practical reasons and some theoretical reasons. So let's cover a few that are practical first. First reason is because we've really never been trained on how to do this. We've never been trained. I mean, we got our training by fire for the last year on how to be remote, but a lot of us have never really worked in a hybrid situation where some people are periodically not in the office and others are in the office, and most people are in the office. So never really been trained on how to facilitate these kind of sessions in the right way. And some of us have never even been trained on how to really participate in the best way. And then the other thing is that technology is not really being fully utilized. We're not using whiteboards. We're not using polling. We're not using annotation. We're not really using all that's available in Zoom or Teams or WebEx. So that's another reason why it's kind of challenging. Third reason is we're distracted. We've got a lot of devices in front of us. We've got a lot of pulls from, whether it's because we're working from home and we've got our family there, we've got distractions from work, etc., but we are distracted. And we're allowing ourselves in some ways to be distracted too, with a lot of us, needing to turn off our cameras at times or wanting to turn it off just to get a little bit of a break. But participants can multitask. So it's really hard for facilitators to keep people engaged. But we're going to address that in this session. The theoretical piece of it, really more, it's like brain science, is that communication is actually more seeing than hearing. There was a lot of research done in the 60s and early 70s that really looked at how people really communicate meaning. And a lot of meaning is sent through actually seeing body language, facial expressions, those kinds of things, and tone of voice. So tone of voice and actual words can get across meaning, but there's a lot of meaning in seeing the person's face and body language. And that makes it hard when we don't have video. Also, it's been proven that people really only collaborate with those they trust or when they're in a safe environment. So if you don't have that in every meeting, you don't have full trust and full community, a really strong community, it can be hard for people to speak up and share their thoughts. Third, it can be really tough to build energy and creativity virtually. I mean, we build, especially extroverts, we really build off the energy of other people in the room, and it can be hard, and you have to be really intentional with creating that in a virtual setting. And then lastly, there's some brain science, and I'm going to talk about that right now, around how is the best way to sustain attention and engagement and retention of information. So let's dive into that. So there's a book called Brain Rules, and it's really actually pretty well read, but it's by a neurological biologist called whose name is John Medina. And he wrote this book, and it's a really easy book to pick up at the library or Amazon or wherever. But you've got, he's got 10 rules on how our brain works and how we can be more effective. But the one that really affects what we're talking about today is really about how people can focus and how long people can stay engaged. And so he's found in his research is that people can really only stay engaged for about 10 minutes. So what does that mean to us as facilitators of meetings that might be hybrid or remote? Well, it means that basically you have to re-engage people with a different activity, a different subject, a different mode, a different technique about every 5 minutes in order to keep people engaged and have them not go do something else. So that's the first rule from John Medina's book. Another one has to do with the retention and connection people make between the information that's being discussed and creativity and actually retaining the information really grows when you integrate more of people's senses. So what does that mean for us? I mean, it'd be great if we could get smell in there and touch, but we haven't figured out that yet. But what we could do is instead of just using words or visuals, do both. So always have a great visual instead of a bunch of words on a page, for example. So you want to integrate both hearing and seeing versus just hearing or seeing whenever you're doing, some kind of facilitation of a hybrid or virtual meeting. So with all those challenges, both practical and theoretical, what I've found is that there's really 4 buckets of types of challenges that happen when you're teaming with a team in a hybrid way. The first one really has to do with whether people are really fully participating, whether you're hearing from everyone, like everyone has a chance to have their voice heard or is willing to have their voice heard. And then the third part of that is once you're hearing from people, are you actually reading the room? Are you reading the fact that people are aligned or not to what's being decided and discussed? So that's one bucket. Another bucket, and these are the 2 we're going to talk about the most as far as solutions because they're the most common, is the preparation that everyone comes to the meeting with. Mostly we're going to talk about facilitator preparation and what are you doing to actually manage the situation so that people have a chance to stay engaged, and then also fully using technology. So these are the main areas of challenges that I found with teams. There's also a couple of other areas that have to do with trust. So if you've got a team that doesn't have a full trust or hasn't really built a community and the culture is not as strong as you'd like it to be, that could be a challenge too. And then lastly, are you doing the things to create an innovative and high space with high energy in it? So those are the main areas of challenges. So the choices you make or the strategies that you employ in order to overcome these challenges really are going to depend on 5 different things. Depends on how many people are attending. If it's a small meeting, you can be more informal with your focus. Also, what are the number of locations and the percentage of people that are remote? If you've got most of the people in the room and only a few people are remote, the techniques and strategies that you use to keep everyone engaged are going to be different than if you've got, half the people that are remote and only half the people in the room. Also, we talked about trust, but the strategies you choose are really going to depend on the trust and that's been built across the participants with the facilitator, not just with the facilitator. So how much do people in the meeting really trust each other, and how familiar are they with each other, etc. Fourth, what technology do you have available? Obviously, the strategies you can use are much more broad if you've got technology that allows you to go beyond just, a Polycom in the middle of the table or just plain old Zoom. And lastly, the complexity of the meeting and the purpose of the meeting. If you've got a meeting where you're making some heavy hitting decisions that are really going to, make a difference in where your company's headed in the near future, or if it's just a quick update, a quick stand-up meeting, the strategies that you use are going to be very different for those types of sessions. So I want to stop just for a minute before I move into some of the solutions and see if anybody has any questions on what I've presented so far.
And feel free, folks, if you do have any specific questions, to either use the chat or unmute yourself to ask Beth a question.
Okay. So what we're going to do right now is we're going to then move into what are this, I have 5 to 10 tips that I'm going to share with you today. These are like my hot tips, the ones that, will work for any team or almost any team in most situations. But if you've got questions about, how you would actually use these techniques, or if you got those don't solve the problem I think I have in this meeting I've been trying to improve on, then you can ask that in the chat or raise your hand or just speak up. So the first one is that this is going to sound really basic, but I have to share it. So it is, make sure you have a clear purpose before the meeting begins, and you let everybody know what that is, either in an email prior or as you start the meeting. It's not just as simple as here's our agenda, although you should have an agenda, but it's also make sure that the purpose of the meeting is very clear to everyone who's attending. And in addition to a purpose, what are the outcomes you're trying to get? So state very clearly, at the end of this meeting, we will know, or we will decide on, what's our timeline for the project, or, whatever it might be. You need to have a clear purpose and outcomes. The second tip I have is that you want to play favorites with the remote people. That is especially in the case of where you only have a few people that are remote. Now, that doesn't mean that you have to invite them to speak first every time, but you want to make sure that you are visually somehow keeping track of who you've heard from. Maybe you've got a round robin going or whatever, but you always want to make sure that you are calling on the remotes or checking in with them somehow to make sure that they have been heard if they have something to say. So play favorite with the remote. Another one is sort of building off of that one, is that you want to have, if you've only got, 10% or less of your participants in a meeting that are remote, what you want to do is maybe have somebody in the meeting that's in the office part of the meeting or in the co-located location with the meeting, with the facilitator even perhaps, is have a buddy for that person. Let's say you have a meeting of 12 people and 3 of them are remote. Assign 3 buddies in the room to those 3 remote people, and just have them, have the person be able to, chat with them on the side, or, using their, a text, just some kind of basic texting to say, hey, John, do you have anything you want to add here? Just checking in with them periodically so that you can be the eyes and ears for them. Another really important one I find is that the more people you engage with a job in the meeting, the more they're going to stay engaged for the whole meeting and not multitask. So that might be something like give somebody the job of taking notes, give somebody the job of closing the meeting with keeping track of action steps and that they are reading them off or typing them in on a whiteboard at the end. You might actually have more people present. Even if it's just a small portion, but having other people be responsible for parts of the meeting spreads out the leadership across the team, but also helps them stay engaged. Also, I would say that you want to use video strategically. That's my fifth tip here, because we've all read a lot about Zoom fatigue, and there's, it affects, we've read that it affects women even more than men. But there's this huge drain that happens for us when we are just constantly being asked to look at ourselves and look at a lot of people in a very close range, at least close from its face, the size of their faces. So you want to ask people to use video and ask them to turn it on when you do need to get feedback, and when you do need to hear from people, rather than just a quick, emoticon or that kind of thing. So ask them to turn on their video at the beginning of a meeting, just so that there's this, really good conversation that starts a presentation perhaps, or information sharing. And then at the end, to make sure you can read whether there's alignment. And then periodically as it's needed throughout. And then the last idea that I share, and this is very similar to the first one, which is about having clear outcomes, you want to close in a strong way. Close the meeting and really try to save 5 minutes at the end to recap what's been discussed and what the next steps are. There's been some research that's been done with some consultants down in Atlanta, but essentially what they found is that when you recap a meeting, 93% of the time, people will complete the next steps on time. When you only recap a meeting like about half the time, less than half the tasks will be completed. So it's really important to have a strong close, and to know that you've got alignment, and to know that people are actually going to follow through with what was been asked of them. So we're about 20 minutes into the session. What I want to do right now is ask if people have any questions, and then after we answer a few of those, then I'll move into how you can use this information in the future for yourself. So what questions do you have on these tips, or other things that you've tried that you want to share with the group, or questions that might be related to, hey, those are great, but I need more ideas?
Again, folks, feel free, if you can, to unmute yourself and ask your question live, or feel free to throw it in the chat if that for some reason your Zoom will not allow you to unmute yourself. There was, Beth, one question that came in, which was, how do you connect with online teams in this virtual setup?
Okay, so if you are talking, maybe the person that asked that question might be able to unmute themselves to say
Naja or Naga. I'm not sure how to pronounce your name.
Yeah, thank you. Actually, I'm calling from Canada, and in this pandemic, I think everything is going online, and it is really difficult to get a response, or when you are doing a session or when you are in a meeting. So how do you gauge that to direct your talk or discussion into that direction, what the audience is looking at? So how can you gauge that in an online kind of a version?
Well, I'm going to try to answer that, and you can tell me if I'm not on point here. I think there's a lot of techniques you can use with questioning. The session I attended last was one about making sure that you're asking open-ended questions. So asking open-ended questions is one way. And if you ask it in a way that allows for people to build on the person they heard before, is a great tool. But also, you might think about doing a round robin. If the meeting is 12 or less people, just kind of go around the room and actually have a piece of paper in front of you where you're checking off as you've gone around. You don't always have to start. In fact, I would recommend not starting with the same person, but making sure you kind of go through. And if somebody says, hey, they've already got my ideas, they can just say ditto, but you're just kind of going through the room to really ask people to speak up.
Yeah, I think the only thing I had trouble is a lot of people don't put the visual on, right? So you don't know, you can't get the feel of how the things are going, and you can't respond that way. So that is, round robin is good when there are less number of participants, but typically if it is about 40 plus or participants, you just can't get the feel what you have in a real live audience, right? So that is what I wanted to get a opinion from your experiences.
Again, you
Thank you.
might ask people to, you know, put the video back on at certain times when it's really critical. And you
Yeah.
won't do it all the time, but you'll ask people, hey, you know, in this part of the session, I'm going to ask you to turn on your camera so that I can get a sense for how things are going.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. Yeah.
Thank you so much for the question. Beth, I'm not sure if you're seeing the chat. There are a few others. I can read a couple of questions that have come in for you, or, okay. One question came in from a Kathleen Rowe. It says, do you announce that you'll assign buddies to remote people? Concerned it would create a potentially weird dynamic if it's done surreptitiously, is one question.
Oh, I've never had that be an issue. Yeah, I would announce it ahead of time just to let, you know, I mean, obviously you'd let the person know that is getting a buddy, and then the buddy has to know because they have to check in. I've never had that be an issue that it was weird because they appreciated it. I think when you talk to remote people, I have another tip that I'll mention in a second, but when you talk to remote people, their biggest frustration is they don't know when and how to get in their words that they want to share. A lot of times people are afraid to look stupid with the wrong kind of question. They can't read the room either because they're not there. That's especially true for minority remote people. They can't read the room, so they don't know if it's the right time to speak up. They don't know how the whole group is reacting. So partially the buddy could be someone like, you know, they could say, hey, looks like most people are agreeing with this. What do you think? You know, like going back and forth on a text. So they truly are the eyes for the remote person, so they can say, here's what's going on in the room. But I've never had that be an issue. So, but I would be upfront about it just to answer your question directly.
There's another.
Go ahead.
Go ahead. If you want to continue, I'm sorry.
No, that's okay. Go ahead.
There's another question along the same lines around tips to ideate when you're trying to really get a team together for ideation. How do you play favorites with the remote to get their ideas or sketches, right? Because there's always somewhat nature where they might be a bit disadvantaged not being in the same physical space.
I think one of the ways is to use the technology more fully. I don't know who asked that question, but if you could let me know that you've tried that. But the whiteboard is really a great place to get ideation on the wall, you know, in front of everyone. I know Microsoft, you know, with their Teams software, they've got the Surface, I don't know, board that people are starting to use now. Companies are starting to using those. Those make it really easy. But if you only have basic technology, using the whiteboard is a great way, and letting others annotate themselves, because it gets, you know, like the bottleneck in the system ends up being the facilitator or the scribe when you've got a room of, you know, 10 plus people. So if you allow other people to annotate a whiteboard, then you can get everything up quickly, and then you've got kind of like the labor's being done by the people with to have the ideas. One way I've seen that happen, putting ideas up, is that you might do a grid where you might, you know, like say in this box, I want you to put ideas for this category, and this box, you know, put ideas up for another category. Sort of like the slide that's up right now. You might put up 4 boxes, and that might be a way, or put up a box for each person on the team. And that's how they add their thoughts. And that way, you know who's inputting and who hasn't.
We've had I tried in the past, although it wasn't particularly effective, where you point the laptop to the whiteboard so the folks remote can at least be seeing what's being drawn, although the resolution is usually a challenge and it wasn't super effective. There's a question here. I'm just scanning through them. It'd be helpful to learn of recommendations for maximizing completeness and effectiveness of pre-meeting messaging and materials. Thoughts around that? Or even the hand raise function, like in Google Meet, there's a question around using tools, more fully using tools. What your tips would be on those? Yeah.
I think for finding out if things, I think using polling ahead of time, you might try that. I mean, Mentimeter has a good, I mean, there's basic polling in Microsoft Teams and Zoom, etc. But Mentimeter is another company that does, you know, offline polling that you could use to ask the question. Like, let me know if this didn't meet your needs or if you're missing something. You know, those would just be some ideas. But if you want to know prior to the session, yeah, I just think I don't have any thoughts on that, except that, you know, just fully using the technology, I think, to get people to interact prior to a session. I'm familiar with Microsoft Teams, but not as much the others.
Yep. There's another question here, like sort of related. One, heterogeneous participants and tips for dealing with large authority gradients. So you've got some folks that are more senior, others more junior, and then they're mixed in hybrid versus in person. What are your thoughts around that dynamic?
I'm assuming that you mean like where somebody has more authority, they might be taking more of the space up. Is that what you mean? I'm not sure.
I'm inferring from the question that large authority might be seniority. So you've got maybe a VP or some really senior execs, and you've got, you know, some newer folks, more junior in role. And what do you do if one, you know, does that dynamic change in hybrid versus in person? What does that look like if that's a factor? That's, I'm assuming, what's meant by the question on authority grading.
Yeah. Well, I think one thought might be to go ahead and if you want to make sure you get that authority's opinion out on the table, then do it like the round robin and make sure that you're asking that person. If that person's not in the room, you know, if they are in the room, I guess it really doesn't matter if they're in the room or not, but sometimes it can be easier to play favorites with remote people by asking them first, but also you know, in this case, it sounds like you needed to kind of play favorites with the authoritative person. And just, you know, just do that, but balance it too. You don't want to just hear from that person consistently.
Right. Couple comments that have, in response to the dialogue here happening through chat. Different cultures deal with authorities differently. Very, very true, no doubt. Some feedback from Brian: in hybrid meetings, try to use a virtual whiteboard for everyone, even participants in the meeting, versus cameras and physical boards. There's Yam Jams, if I got the name of it right. We were big Google users, and so you can launch in the middle of a Google Meet a jam session. Those have been, the tools are a little clunky. It's harder to use it with your mouse than perhaps, you know, you're standing in front of a whiteboard, but they can be pretty creative, and you can have many people drawing at the same time. So there's some pretty cool things you can do in a digital board that you can't do on a real board. So there's some neat ideas that I've seen there. Let's see. And I've been, again, a comment. I've really enjoyed the hand raised function. Any suggestions for how to continue that culture of hand raising for people in the room, right? Because then you've got an imbalance of who can use it and who can't. Any thoughts on that, Beth?
If you have a camera that's being pointed at the table, you know, if you're at a conference table, then you might have just people raise their hands, like physically raise their hands. I think that's another benefit of doing like polling and having everybody on a device, even though they're in the room. So they could still have everybody have their device in order to do the emoticon that everyone else is using.
There's a couple points that have been shared as well. One comment just regards to authoritative gradients. Asian cultures typically have a high gradient. I've seen that as well in some cases with Indian cultures, where junior members, so they have asked the senior folks to hold off on brainstorming to enable and create an environment for the junior folks not intimidated. I've seen that as well. Likewise, because there's a culture of not speaking unless asked to speak. And so I think that's a great protocol too.
That's a really good point. I should have said that ahead of time, is make sure that you're communicating with the authority in the room what your expectations are too, and how you're trying to balance the input from all levels. Chris, I'm going to go ahead and move on just so I can get to kind of the next points. So this slide is basically part of a Word document that I have to share. Chris and I haven't figured out how to send that out yet, unfortunately, because of the chat feature, but I will somehow figure it out. If you would like to do, I guess here's my suggestion. I have, I've done this workshop actually at Product Camp last year for St. Louis, and it was really well received. And the workshop really allowed people to first assess, I'm going to go a couple of slides forward, to assess a meeting. So I've got, like 10, 11 questions that you can pick a meeting that you want to improve on. Just pick one. And do an initial assessment, like what are the issues, or what are the, what's the current state of that meeting? Are facilitators fully prepared? Or, is the meeting, do we have meeting guidelines that we follow regularly? These are all like good questions to ask yourself. Give it a rating from 1 to 5, and then decide what are the themes that emerge from that? Like, what are the 2 lowest questions, 2 lowest scores? And what are the themes that you see emerging? And then I've got some tips. Some of them I mentioned today, some of them are on this list. I've got a couple of, I've got, a good long dozen ways that you can, in preparation or during the meeting, or in order to make a strong close, on how to improve the meeting. I've also got some other tools that I can share with you, but it really is very dependent. And so here, I'm just basically sharing my email address here. If for some reason we cannot figure out how to get you this Word file, please send me an email. If you would like some more tools and resources, I'm happy to share them with you. I also have a training video. It's 5 minutes on what I just gave you in this presentation. And then I have another 4-minute video on the top tips. So if you liked what you heard today and you think your team or people that you work with might get some benefit out of hearing the same thing rather than listening to this whole 30 minutes, I've got two 5-minute videos that I can share with you through YouTube that you can you can share with others to try to get a conversation going about, okay, we're going to be hybrid in the future. How can we make this better? How can we be more productive and more collaborative and more creative when we're working together? So again, if we can't figure out how to get this to you through this Slack channel or, some other means, then please email me at beth@distanceteaming.com and I can give you what you're looking for.